for coming. Today we're going to talk about corporate environmental scandals. And they're really spectacular failures that left a toxic legacy. Some of these have been turned into Hollywood films, and we'll be discussing the films, but I wanted to make this about people, about how it affects people in communities that had these toxic situations going on. And we're talking about the Monsanto seeds problem, the Volkswagen emission scandal, Kerr-McGee radiation, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl disaster, Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E, BP oil spill, Love Canal, the burn pits, military use, and DuPont with Teflon in Woburn, Massachusetts. We'll start with DuPont and Teflon. Rob Lloyd, shown here, was a corporate lawyer for large chemical companies in the 90s. He was approached by a West Virginia farmer living in Parkersburg, West Virginia. The farmer had 190 of his cows getting sick. And because they all lived near a plant called the DuPont processing plant here, where they made Teflon here. A toxic chemical was used in the production of the nonstick substance known as Teflon in frying pans and carpet flooring in the culprit here. Actually, tens of thousands of gallons of contaminant called perfluorooctanoic acid, or C8, or PFOA, were dumped in a landfill near the town of Parkersburg, West Virginia. DuPont started using C8, or PFOA, in its Teflon production at the Parkersburg factory in '51. By '54, they noted the chemical was likely to be toxic. By '61, they knew it was toxic in animals, and by '82, by humans. Samples from the Ohio River showed toxicity levels of the compound 8 times higher than normal, which made its way into the drinking water of the towns around the area in Ohio and West Virginia. Lott then pursued a decades-long class action suit against this company, representing thousands of Parkersburg citizens that got his drinking water near this manufacturing plant. Many innocent citizens then contracted diseases like kidney cancer, testicular cancer from PFOA, known for decades to cause life-threatening conditions. DuPont paid a record of $16 million to the EPA for hiding the alarming truth that PFOA chemicals were linked to cancer and birth defects. DuPont promised to phase this chemical out. Actually, there were 3,500 lawsuits, and DuPont then settled with Lott for $671 million. And this turned into a film about 5 years ago called Dark Waters. And there's Lott as an actor going to see the West Virginia farmer. And now they have seminars about PFOA toxicology for attorneys. How this relates to other companies? Well, 3M Products did this too. 3M reaches out to have a $10.3 billion settlement for contamination. So this was done because of what they call forever chemicals. Now, how this relates to you is that the city of Tampa Bay, this just made the business news 2 weeks ago on the radio, I heard, there's new water filtration system expected to help remove forever chemicals like the C8 and then later on chromium-6 in their water supply. This costs tens of millions of dollars to get rid of them. And Karen Silkwood was a 28-year-old plutonium processing worker working at the Kerr-McGee Cimarron River nuclear facility near Crescent, Oklahoma in the early 70s. She was actually there with her co-workers, and what they did was they made plutonium, these uranium rods, for work in the nuclear reactor. So here she is making, they make these bundles here. So here she is making them, and she was also on the union's bargaining committee there, and began to investigate health and safety issues that put her co-workers at risk with radioactive contamination. They made plutonium fuel rods there. She found inadequate safety measures, lax rules, improper storage of samples, falsification of records, and spills and exposure that put her co-workers in jeopardy. In 1974, she became a whistleblower as she worked here and then testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about conditions she found there at the lab, being exposed to plutonium herself. Later in '74, she was to meet with union officials and a reporter about further documentation she had, but just before the meeting, she was involved in a fatal car crash. And that was her, and this is her car that crashed. Foul play was suspected, but not proved to this day. Okay, so accusations flew back and forth as to who's to blame for the radiation there. Some on planets, whatever. This turned into a movie called Silkwood. Meryl Streep won Best Actress for her portrayal of Karen Silkwood. So this is a scathing documentary, really, or indictment of the nuclear industry and how poorly it treated its plant workers. Speaking of nuclear messes, there was a partial meltdown at the 3 Mile Island in 1979, the power plant there near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The core was exposed, causing major damage. Half the fuel melted, and important mechanical failures resulted in the release of radioactive material. People were evacuated, but there was no real deaths or anything associated with this. It was a lucky break. However, 3 weeks before this, a movie came out called The China Syndrome. And it was released before this, and the movie was a pretend fictional account of a television news crew that coincidentally was present at a nuclear plant core meltdown and had filmed the dramatic disaster as it happened. The movie eerily predicted what took place just a few weeks later on. So Hollywood got it right here. And this is something that Bob knows something about. This is the Fernald nuclear weapons plant in Ohio, speaking of nuclear power. And the workers there were involved in a class action lawsuit that created conditions for them to be exposed to excessive radiation levels. This family, the Clausen family, were involved in this. When you put a face to it, it makes more sense. And this family suffered a great deal, and they filed a lawsuit against this. Actually, thousands of them were exposed to this in a period of time. They didn't have the safeguards in place. And the same thing in Hanford. They had a nuclear facility processing plant to make uranium and then send it to be turned into plutonium. They had a site in an Indian reservation, and the Indian people there, the Native Americans, are very upset that they're in these giant canisters here because they don't know where to store the materials. In other words, if you make something, you need to be able to store it correctly, however that takes. So that's how it relates to this. Now, this is the case in 1998. Percy Spicer, shown here, was a Saskatchewan canola farmer. He was accused and sued by Monsanto Canada for illegally using their seeds to plant his 1,000-acre canola crop. See, the seeds were genetically modified to be resistant to the Monsanto's weed killer Roundup. Schmeisser never bought any of Monsanto's seeds and always steadfastly collected his own in jars and planted them over the seasons. Yet testing showed that 98% of his crop was Monsanto Roundup ready be resistant to the seeds to be resistant. Monsanto thought he purchased the seeds on the black market and got away with not paying Monsanto $15,000. Well, Schmeisser said the seeds just fell off my truck, or the bees pollinated it. It's not my problem. So there was a lawsuit involved, and the Supreme Court got involved and found Schmeisser to be guilty, but didn't have to pay because he never used Roundup on his crop in the first place. So it was a win for Schmeisser. He didn't have to pay, but it was a win for Monsanto because it was the first time 20 years ago intellectual property was being tested. So, and this was made into a film called Percy vs. Goliath about 4 or 5 years ago. And it showed the heavy-handed tactics a large agricultural company used against a simple farmer who was just trying to do his job. Actually, this is Percy right here, the man who beat Monsanto, but ironically, there was a large suit involved using Roundup plants. Excuse me. Monsanto just settled a class action lawsuit paying to some tens of thousands of consumers who had used Roundup on their property. Many plaintiffs, just folks like you and me that would use Roundup on your driveway or around, actually have linked this glyphosate-based weed killer to carcinogenic problems like lymphoma. So this is the team that won. Monsanto had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars. So in a way, Schmeisser was right all at the same time. This is the, on October 20th, 2010, an oil rigging rig called Deepwater Horizon, owned by BP Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico, exploded and sank, killing 11 workers and releasing 4 million barrels or 134 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf. Oil flowed into the Gulf for 87 days before finally being capped. This oil spill was one of the largest in the history of the petroleum industry. And what it did was, this oil spill affected 600 miles of coastline in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. It was 57,000 square miles big, and it, what it did was it affected the economies down there. People go down there to go to the beaches. They have fishing industries, that was shut down, tourism, and as well as local economies. Tens of thousands of people were unemployed. Actually, I was living in the coastal city of Pensacola then in 2010, and couldn't go to the beaches, couldn't do anything because the oil was there. Actually, Obama came there to give them federal aid, all these municipalities down here. And this is what I would see. And this is in Orange Beach, Alabama, where many tourists go to. This is what it was like. And I saw this, the hazmat, the workers using hazmat clothes to clean this up. This oil spill affected this area here by BP. And this is what I saw in Pensacola Beach. When they were cleaning it up, it was 90 degrees on the beach. So the people in these hazmat suits, according to OSHA rules, could only work 15 minutes an hour to do this. The manager at Pensacola Beach I talked to personally was really dismayed. He said they're not getting any work done because they work 2.5 hours a day just to clean this up. And you really don't need a supervisor to do this. I also saw these kind of, what they call booms here, to absorb the oil coming in. That was also in my community. So we saw this. And we lost about 7,000 dead animals for this, for birds and sea life. It cost BP $40 billion. They were fined by the EPA, as well as they had to pay an awful lot in settlements, plus billions more for settlements. People would have fishing industries, and they were shut down for at least 6 months, so they filed suit. So BP paid about $60 billion for this tragedy here. Saw this? These are the balloons I was talking about to keep the oil from going. And this was made into a movie called Deepwater Horizon in 2016, based on a true story. And don't worry about them losing any money on this. BP every quarter makes between $1 billion and $2 billion every quarter. Now I presented some cases here, and you might say, well, that's just, what can I do about it? Well, it's your wallet and your purse that talks about this. If you don't like the company involved in this, and when you can, don't buy products with Monsanto or DuPont if you can. I refuse to go to BP oil stations for the last 14 years to get my car filled up with gas. So let your pocketbook do the talking.
That's true.
You think that's ineffective? Mahatma Gandhi did this in the 1930s with the Indian textile workers. He wanted to support them. And he had a boycott on some products. Martin Luther King did this in the 1960s with the Montgomery bus boycott. It does work. It's a little bit passive, but no one gets hurt, and the anger goes from your pocketbook than them not having it. So that's how to solve this kind of a problem. This is Erin Brockovich. She was a file clerk at an LA law firm in the 90s. One day she found some paperwork associated with PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, concerning residents of a California Mojave desert town of Hinckley. So this is regarding the chromium-6 contamination. Now Hinckley's is not too far from Barstow, and hundreds of acres were contaminated by chromium-6 in an area here. So she investigated further. And actually what the company did was they operated a gas pumping oil well there, and they sprayed it down with chromium-6 to prevent rust. And they sprayed it down there for about 14 years. But eventually, this chromium-6, which is an anti-corrosive element, would, and to protect this area, would then seep into the soil and contaminating the area, the ground aquifer down there. So residents began complaining of all kinds of situations. So Erin, with investigating herself, was well testing, this is her right there, and with field work, she traced the pollution back to the PG&E compressor station in Hinckley. She had no college background, no knowledge of any kind of health problems about, or any kind of science and background in anything, but she did this work on her own. And then she talked to the town residents if they suffered from chronic cough, reoccurring bronchitis, rashes, nosebleeds. Chromium-6 is carcinogenic, causes liver and stomach cancer, and was poisoning the residents there. So 600 of the town's residents then hired Erin's firm to represent them in a class action lawsuit against PG&E. And PG&E knew that they were aware of this and tried to cover up this case. So again, to sum up this, what happened was the contamination of the water with chromium-6. It was the California town of Hinckley, and for 14 years it used to fight corrosion in the cooling tower. The wastewater was discharged into unlined pools and obviously went into the city's wells. So the case was settled for $333 million, and this was the largest settlement ever paid in a lawsuit at that time. So Erin's firm got $133 million, and Erin herself got $2 million. This was made into a Hollywood film called Erin Brockovich. 22 years ago, Julia Roberts won for Best Actress for this. This is the real Erin Brockovich, who wrote a book about this, and now is a consumer advocate going around to different environmental problems in different parts of the world and America. And she's concerned right now about a small island in the Indonesian archipelago called Obi Island. And there they mine nickel. And nickel is used, well, actually I have some right in my lithium-ion battery here, about 2 or 3 ounces. But it's mainly used now, nickel, in batteries for EV cars. Actually about 80 pounds of it are used. So when this mining goes on, then slag is brought up, and millions of tons of this, and the rainwater gets on this, and then seeps all these things like lead or lead and chromium as well as nickel into the soil, polluting the groundwater down there. It shouldn't have been dug up, but it has to be because you have to make this. So this concerns the health and environment of Obi Island's people. That's how this relates to this. So did it have a happy ending? Well, not for Roberta Walker. Her character is featured in the film. She was awarded $5 million, but saw little of it. Actually, she grew up in Hinckley, had a husband and had 2 daughters. And their house had to be torn down twice because they had to move twice because of the contamination in the area there. Both daughters had nosebleeds as kids. Both daughters later on had hysterectomies as well as fibromyalgia. Her whole family suffers from asthma. Her husband has prostate cancer. So she wasn't happy, yet it's found as one of these forever chemicals in the water. You have to have a very advanced filtration system to get rid of it. So this is how this affects people on a one-on-one level. Now we're talking about Flint, Michigan. Hinckley's story is not an isolated incident. In other towns like Flint, Michigan, they've also been fighting for clean water too. The Flint crisis began in 2014, and Flint's shown here, when the city began taking water from the Flint River. Without proper treatment, the water became contaminated with lead from the pipes in the old buildings. So there was lead being pumped out to the citizens of Flint. And it came out like this, and they did their dishes in it. They ultimately had to get bottled water, and then they started protesting. This made national news for 3 weeks in a row 10 years ago. That this was done improperly because they didn't think of a cause and effect of what would happen here. So actually the Michigan government, state of Michigan, got involved and has an extensive lead service pipe replacement project that continues to today. Water lines continue to be evacuated and inspected. And now the state agreed to pay the citizens there $600 million for this disaster. Now, about water contamination, how else does this affect? Well, this is in Woburn, Massachusetts. For a period of 22 years, they had 28 cases of childhood leukemia and 16 deaths. That's unacceptable for an area this small. So something was going on. This is 3.5-year-old Jimmy Anderson actually got childhood leukemia. Her mother, Ann Anderson, suspected that there was contamination in the water. And then she talked to other families, and 8 other families and her got together to file a lawsuit. And they used a man named Jan Schlickman to do this. Here is the real Jan Schlickman. Here is the actor portraying him to file suit. So they had to do an investigation. Where did this pollution come from? So, Riley Tannery Company had dumped trichloroethylene into the local river there, as well as used as a dumping ground in isolated areas. And it contaminated the soil and went into the drinking water. Riley Leather Company is owned by Beatrice Foods and W.R. Grace. So Schlickman decided to file suit against W.R. Grace and Beatrice Foods, claiming that these corporations were responsible for contaminating 2 city-owned wells that supplied water to the town, which in turn caused their children horrific liver disease and central nervous system disorders. And so Schlickman investigated himself. That's what you have to do. You have to go out, not read paper in an office. You have to go out and see it. Here he is, checking to see where these barrels were dumped into the river here of trichloroethylene. He settled for $8 million, so the 9 families involved got about $300,000, which is a nice settlement back in the day. Actually, the contaminated site, the companies had to pay for cleanup, about $68 million, and were fined also. It was maybe the largest settlement for everything involved in that area, in the northeast area, back about 25 years ago. And a movie was made in this called The Civil Action. Here's the actor who portrayed him, and this is the real Jan Schlickman. So, and he's, in my opinion, this would be a hero for standing up and fighting for people's rights and causes here. This is the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, India. There existed a large pesticide plant owned by American-owned Union Carbide. In 1984, 45 tons of the dangerous chemical methyl isocyanate, which is cyanide, escaped from the plant. The chemical was kept in a large tank that gave way. The plant's alarm system did not work for hours, and a flare tower to burn off toxic gases had not been operational for months. So toxic gas was released in a very condensed, populated area. Within a matter of minutes, the gas spread over the surrounding area, immediately killing thousands of people and created panic as thousands fled. The death toll at first was 8,000 killed by being smothered. They couldn't get oxygen, they couldn't breathe. Thousands later died from gas-related illnesses. Up to 500,000 more citizens there experienced respiratory systems, internal hemorrhaging, pneumonia, breathing maladies, and even blindness due to the toxic gas. So here's the tank that they kept it in. Here's the area that it gave way. This happened 40 years ago in Bhopal. Affected people, about 500,000. Tens of thousands died. The worst disaster ever. And these are widows and moms that have lost their kids and husbands, and they wanted to have responsibility for this. So the settlement was reached of $470 million, which amounted to just barely a few $100s for each Indian life. That's how much an Indian life was worth 40 years ago. Here's a wall of shame, all the people that have died for this because of asphyxiate inhalation poisoning. This exposed an industry and they had substandard operating and safety procedures and an understaffed plant, and it led to this disaster. This could have been better also.
They never admitted it.
I probably would think you're right, and thank you for saying that.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The man said that they never admitted it.
Union Carbide did not make it.
That's
okay,
correct,
Okay.
and thank you. This is Camp Lejeune, a famous Marine training camp in North Carolina. And for a period of 35 years, from 1953 to 1987, there were some toxic problems going on here. Marine Corps families unknowingly drank and bathed in toxic water. The water had been contaminated for decades from chemicals dumped in the area from a dry cleaning facility, leaky storage tanks, and general chemical dumping. The chemicals were tetrachloroethylene, trichloroethylene, vinyl chloride, benzene, and 70 other contaminants. And obviously they got into the well water of the Marine Corps base here. So people started complaining and having problems, all kinds of physical problems there. And this is the base that it was on the very eastern shore of North Carolina, very large military base there. And now there's a lawsuit. You can see this on cable TV sometimes, they advertise this. 5,000 people have signed up for this because of these. There were service people living in that area from benzene, vinyl chloride, and tetrachloroethylenes. So this is what's going on there. And speaking of the military, these are burn pits. These have been in the news a while. They were used as a waste disposal method by the U.S. military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001 and after. So in other words, in order to get rid of sensitive material and anything to do with the military, they burned it so that the enemy wouldn't have it. That makes sense in one part, but the other part didn't make sense was the air that the servicemen and our servicewomen breathed in, which was toxic. So after a while of this, high volumes of toxic gases like metals, polyvinyl compounds, and volatile compounds were then released in the air like benzene and PCB materials. Many servicemen and women began to complain of a variety of ailments linked to heart disease, COPD, lung cancer, respiratory issues, brain and pancreatic, kidney, lung, and stomach cancers were associated with this. And now the PACT Act has come to help out on this, and the VA is being involved. But again, it's real easy to burn something, but then the residue left over from it and what you breathe can be very serious on your body for many months exposed to this. And speaking of the same, this is asbestos. Sometimes you see these commercials on TV about asbestos. Asbestos has, been used for 150 years by companies to make a wide variety of useful products. It's composed of tiny fibers, right here, that resist heat, chemicals, and fire. It's an excellent fire retardant and used widely in industry. Plant workers, laborers, and miners, shown here, drywall installers, steel workers, carpenters, and the like have been exposed to asbestos for years. So what that does is, in the body, there's normal lungs, but breathing in asbestos gives you what I would call a white lung. That is, too much fibers in your lung system, which can eventually turn into mesothelioma, causing a tumor from this here. This would affect, in your body, the esophagus, the pleural membrane, the diaphragm, the abdomen, the larynx, the heart, and lung tissue. So they were breathing this in. This is called mesothelioma, and I get cards like this. No one should battle mesothelioma alone. And from this. So there are lawyers, and you see these commercials on cable about people handling these kind of lawsuits. There are hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits involved in this. And there's an interesting side product here. A lot of people use this Johnson's baby powder. It's made of talc. And people sometimes use a lot of it. Obviously that goes into your lungs. Obviously that can cause problems. Tens of thousands of people filed a class action lawsuit against Johnson & Johnson's. And this company then filed bankruptcy. So now this is in the Supreme Court. Can you file bankruptcy Is it just easy by going like this, I'm bankrupt, I'm not gonna pay anybody? And can people with awful lot of money say the same thing, not file bankruptcy, but pay a large lump sum because they have the money, like the Sackler family with opiate crisis, and get away with it? We'll have to find out what the Supreme Court says. So this is also a physical mess. So there are 1,344 Superfund sites around America. Many of them are in the Northeast or the Rust Belt or out in California. In Michigan alone, there's 6,600 toxic sites. 65 of them are designated as Superfund sites. So the issue is, again, as I've told you before, how do you store these barrels? You put them in a landfill, some rural place out in the middle of nowhere. You leave them by a stream where no one can find them. Obviously, they're gonna rust out and then leak. So how do you deal with the waste of what you make? And another situation comes up on an ethical point. How much is somebody's life worth? If you lose your life because of toxic environments, if you get leukemia, if you have a kidney that doesn't work anymore because of these elements, if you have half a lung that needs to be removed, how much is that worth? So they have actuarial tables. And who would get more? A bricklayer? A policeman? An office worker? A post office worker? Who gets more, who gets less? Well, let's check this out. The September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, clearly, over 20 years ago, we had a horrific attack on our soil. And this created an environmental mess for the tens of thousands of people living in Manhattan at the time. So Congress appropriated $2.8 billion. 55,000 people submitted aid applications. I mean, everybody. People living there, people, first responders. Award decisions, 112, and they've only doled out $27 million because they ran out of money. So the issue is money also behind the cleanup. And this is Love Canal. Actually, Love Canal exists in a town called Niagara Falls, New York, on the very western edge of New York. And they had a situation there where there was a canal there that Hooker Chemicals and Plastic dumped 22,000 tons, or 22,000 something or other, in this canal in the town of Niagara Falls. Let me get my statistics right. 22,000 tons, thank you. And they dumped chloride biophenols and dioxins into this. Actually, Hooker Chemicals made plastics, they made perfumes, fertilizers, an all-purpose chemical company. And during the 40s and 50s, they made dyes, perfumes, and solvents there also. So they dumped them in this canal area, and it looked like this, in a ditch really. And then, later on, somebody bought it for like $1, from what I remember, the area, the canal area, and they started to build on it. It was capped with dirt, and this was the canal, and houses were built right next to this. Well, in 1978, they started having seepage. Seepage in playgrounds, seepage in basements, seepage all over, and people were starting to have problems there. Like there were too many in the area of miscarriages, there had high levels of chromosomal damage, they had asthma, migraines, the people living there, and this was not a healthy environment. So when you add in these kind of chemicals, this is the recipe that you get for being there. No one bothered to line the area or to take care of it properly. And this was Hooker Chemicals and Plastics that did this. So this is a picture of then, what it looked like then, the canal, and now with homes moved further, much further away from it and being cleared here. So over time, 239 families were located, and then later 700 other families were affected and also relocated. Over time, 1,300 Love Canal residents were awarded a settlement of $20 million in damages. The negligent company agreed to pay $98 million to the state for cleanup and another $130 million to the United States government. This is one of the most famous environmental disasters, all because someone didn't take care of the cause and effect of what this would happen. These are kids protesting in the area, He just wants a swimming pool in his backyard, not a cesspool. So that's another way to do this, is to protest. When the BP spill oil came, I was on the Pensacola beach doing a hands across the beach, and I met our governor in person and talked to him right there on the beach about this problem. So people do come out to these things. So, it's a disaster area, and the city did fail them. Yes. Imagine you're want to live somewhere with your spouse and raise a family and have a house, the American dream, and end up living next to a toxic dump. One of the things is the Palmerton is a small town in eastern Pennsylvania, about 5,500 people, home to the New Jersey Zinc Company, which was the nation's largest producer of zinc. Here they mined zinc or sphalerite and then made brass or construction materials. So what to do with the slag? You mine it? Okay, so what do you do with the slag? So you put it in this pile here, but this pile is 2.5 miles long, 100 feet tall, and 500 to 1,000 feet wide. So when it rained or snowed on this pile, then all the toxic elements in this that were buried underground all come above ground and go into the city's water supply. So you had things like lead, copper, cadmium, and zinc all going in there, which made the kids have high levels of lead in them, which is very bad, as well as the cattle, the fish, and the whole area was contaminated. This was put on a Superfund site in '83. In '87, it was all cleaned up. The company was fined. This is an example of how an area can be cleaned up, about how they took care of this. And this is, we move on to the Volkswagen emissions scandal. This is a different kind of animal. For 6 years, from 2009 to 2015, Volkswagen cars had a defeat device on them. That's right, it had software that activated pollution controls only when the car was being tested. So this is called Dieselgate or emissions gate, which means that when the car was being tested by the EPA to see if it fits in with standards that they have for emissions control, the car worked wonderfully, and they had great results. But when the car was put on the road, the software thing was taken off, and the car emitted up to 40 times the amount of nitrogen oxide into the air. So cars like the Beetle, Jetta, Golf, Passat, VW were putting in all this pollution into the air. 11 million diesel vehicles worldwide were putting out noxious fumes into the air because they passed the test, but in real life, it was just a cheat to get people to entice them to buy the car. So this became a scam, and nitrogen oxide, how this relates to me? Well, my grandfather had emphysema. So I know about people who have breathing problems, and people in my family have asthma problems. So this affected, we think, tens of thousands of people that have premature deaths. No one ever talks about the pollution in the air. We're always concerned about global warming, but no one talks about what's in the air, what's in the water we drink. That's rarely ever discussed, and it's about time to discuss it. So what happened with this? This is called Volkswagen, and yeah, that happens too. So they did, again, real well on tests, but in real life, in the real roads, they didn't. So this amounted to fines. They admitted guilt in 2017. They had to pay $4.5 billion in penalties, and will spend $30 billion worldwide and $20 billion alone for cars in the U.S. to fix them. They're going to try to compensate customers with $5,000 or $10,000 discount coupons, basically to help them out. This was an emissions scandal, and it created 6 Volkswagen employees in Germany to go to jail. This man here was given a reduced sentence of 1.5 years in prison. Imagine if we were responsible for doing something like that to cars. I'll get to the end of this. Imagine doing that to people and getting only 1.5 years in prison. How much time would we get in prison if we did that? A long time. So this is, I don't think that's very fair. And I'll get your questions at the end of this. You think the people will learn from this? Oh, no. Cummins Engines just made the news last week. Will pay $1.6 billion because they make engines for compensation here, because they made engines for Dodge Ram trucks, and they made engines for the Mack trucks. Their engines had a defeat device on them too for software. So they did real well on testing, but not on the roads, so they have to settle with this. So history repeats itself. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the 5 most polluted places in the world. And this is all over the world. I want to let you know, besides America or industrialized countries, there are other places that have really bad news to talk about. One of them is Chernobyl. Another one is Dzernik, Russia. Another one, the Citrium River in Indonesia. The electronic waste dump in Ghana. And the Argentina River. This is Chernobyl. It was a nuclear power plant in Ukraine that was the site of the disastrous nuclear accident in April of about 40 years ago, in 86. A routine test at the power plant went horribly wrong, and 2 massive explosions blew a 1,000-ton rope off the plant's reactors, releasing 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 30 workers died, and the neighboring town was evacuated. So what was released into the air was this. Was radioactive iodine-131, plutonium, cesium-137, and strontium-90. This blew across into Belarus next door and blew into the neighboring Scandinavian countries like Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and it was a disaster. The power plant, by the way, is north of Kiev in Russia, here. So 360,000 people had to be evacuated, a massive government firefighting effort using Russian troops to contain the fire, and a concrete dome was put over it to protect it. Before Chernobyl, after. Before and after. So what this did was, this then contaminated, I shouldn't say that word. In total, tens of thousands of Ukrainians and citizens living in the former Western Soviet countries died over time with thyroid cancers and leukemia. Imagine having your child, you were born in this area, and then dying because of leukemia, all because of a government failure. So this is what the town looks like now. It's really a ghost town right out of this dystopian movie. And it's a ghost town, and it'll never come back because you can't live there for thousands of years. And there's all the produce had to be thrown away. There's a 1,000-mile exclusion area, square mile exclusion area around the whole place, all because of cesium-137. If you go there, then you need to have a Geiger counter because you only last about 3 or 4 hours in there, and then you need to leave. All the animals there have been slightly deformed and have 6 toes and the usual bit. This was the dome that was put over it. So this was a disaster. Another one, this is the dirtiest river in the world. You remember Obi Island? Well, on Java Island, in between Sumatra and Borneo, there's a 190-mile river called the Citrium River. There's 2,000 factories that line the river over this course of this river. And there's 200 textile plants, and they dumped everything into the river. They could. And this affected the health of people there. In this river, it has coliform bacteria 5,000 times higher than mandatory limits, 1,000 times higher than our EPA safe water drinking limits. Heavy metals like aluminum, iron, and manganese, fertilizers, and household waste permeate this river. So people there had problems with child development, renal failure, chronic bronchitis, and a significant incidence of tumors. Imagine this. So you think it just sits there, huh? It doesn't. After a while, plastic degrades into what they call microplastics. Very, very tiny, small pieces that eventually get into the rivers, that go into the oceans, that go into our drinking water, that's in your body right now, that's in your bottled water right now. Speaking of bottled water, why is there so much junk here? Because every minute we produce 1 million water bottles a minute. That means over 1 billion a day. In 2 years, you would have over 1 trillion of them. That's just in 2 years. So what to do with the waste? And plastic is made out of oil. So you have oil in your body. So the government troops are starting to clean this up. Good luck with that. Many of the countries don't have recycling programs like we have here. Only 5% of things are recycled in the whole world, 5% of materials. It's a big problem. This is my favorite one. This is a place called Ghana, which is on the west coast of Africa. And in it they have the capital is Accra, and in Accra they have a suburb called Aglabashi. It's a dump site, which means that 200,000 tons come by ship every year to dump materials here. And this is a dumping place for Europeans, for affluent countries that have all these products. So what do you do with your old computer? What do you do with your old TV? What do you do with your tires that you want to throw away? Your microwave, your laptops? Where do you throw them away? For Europeans, it's sent here. It's then burned, and then people go around in the area scavenging for things like aluminum, copper, to make a very small, a small wage of a couple dollars a day. That's what they do here, and this is what this looks like. Well, so then you're saying, well, what do we do with our electronic waste? Where do we dump them? You can put a tracker on it and find out. 2/3 of it is disposed of properly. However, 1/3 of it in the past has been sent to Guiyang, China, where it's another dumping ground. These are all keyboards, for instance, and it's a dumping ground for, again, affluent countries putting their things in there. China has not allowed this for a while, but it doesn't matter, because they just send it to, the ships would just go to Vietnam, any coastal area, or Thailand. Just dump it there. Somewhere it's gotta be dumped. So, that's electronics. What about clothes? Well, in South America, in the Atacama Desert, on the western part of Chile, where it doesn't rain for 2 or 3 years, they dump clothes there. Hundreds of thousands of tons of clothes are dumped there. It's so large of a dump that you can see it from space. And we make too many clothes. This is called clothes pollution. We make too many of them. Just wear what you have, if you can. There's no need to have that many clothes. And we've overproduced clothes, we've overproduced everything, so we don't know what to do with it when we get rid of it. This is Dzernik, Russia. This is the world's most polluted city in the world. It's on the eastern part of, the western part of Russia. And what they did was this was a place where they made materials there to make Russia a superpower. And what they did was they made things here like munitions and other chemicals, and they just dumped it in the area. 300,000 tons were dumped in the Dzernik area. What they did was they made sarin gas there, aluminum neurotoxins, mustard gas, and tetraethyl lead also out there. This helped the Russian war machine. You wonder why Russia has all these materials? Back how they're becoming a superpower? Well, they made them here in Dzernik. And of course, they just dumped it in the area. How does that relate to somebody like me? Well, my grandfather had mustard gas poisoning in World War I. I know about that. So, this affected the life out there. This is what they call the White Sea out in Dzernik, a place where 100-acre lake where they dump chemical materials. There's all the elements of the periodic table are there. Usually I don't show graphs. There's only one graph I'm going to show you today. And for the past 80 years and even more, Russia's had the lowest life expectancy of any country in the world. People die there in their mid-60s, generally speaking, even today. But in Dzernik, the average life expectancy for a woman is 47 years. For a man, it's 42 years. This is what they've done. They want to build a canal to siphon this off, a 6-mile one, to siphon this off. And I'm not sure how they're doing on that. But I kind of think Russia has other plans on its mind than cleaning up toxic sites, as we can guess. This is in this is in Buenos Aires, Argentina. There's a river that runs through it called the Metaza Rialto River, and it runs through the heart of it. It runs through 14 municipalities in it. Now, Rio is one of the few major cities in the southern hemisphere. It's very beautiful. A lot of tourists go to it. But people don't know about this. They dumped chemicals in this river because there's 15,000 industries lining the river. They dump things like zinc, lead, chromium in this river in a world-class city. So it looks like this. which is disgusting, and it looks like this. Here's the river running through neighborhoods through this. You can do a lot better than that in Argentina. And this is the Fukushima plant that had a tsunami in 2011, and a 46-foot wave went over and then affected these 3 reactors. There was a meltdown. 18,000 people died in this. They had to evacuate tens of thousands of people. There's a 300-mile exclusion area around this area for the Fukushima plant. And some of that radioactive waste has gone over to our country, and they're releasing it to this day, little bits and parts of it, because they kept all this nuclear water that was contaminated. So what to do with it? They have to release it in the ocean once in a while, and of course it just comes over to us. This is probably the last thing I want to show you. This is Cancer Alley. This is in America. At the lower part of the Mississippi, there's all these chemical plants. There is, let's take a look. There's Dow Chemical, there's Shell Chemical, Union Carbide, and they're all releasing things in. The environment is not very good there because they release chemicals into the water, as well as affect the area of people living here with the air. This is called environmental racism because a lot of black people live in this area and are exposed to all these chemical facilities here. So when they protested, the EPA wasn't investigating on this, and then they decided just to drop it, so it's not investigating anymore. On a similar note, and with regarding to the Mississippi area, it flows obviously into the Gulf of Mexico. And what it does is it picks up a lot of fertilizers from places like Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and then picks it up from the ground and dumps it into the Gulf of Mexico, and it creates a dead zone there. That means there's so much fertilizer there, it creates algae blooms. The algae blooms grow on top of the water and then sink and then use up all the oxygen. So an area the size of New Jersey, there's a dead zone here, 7,800 square miles. When I was living in Pensacola, we knew people that went there to investigate, is the dead zone growing or is it shrinking? But it's about the same, but nothing can go live there because there's no oxygen in the water. So that's what's going on there. This is what we've done. There's about 15 other dead zones in areas where there's major deltas that go into the, like the Mediterranean Sea, and major rivers go into deltas around the world. So that's what's going on with that. And you're probably wondering, this is the end of the show, why I'm so enthusiastic or want to talk to you about this. And it must come from something inside. I can only give a lecture unless I believe in it. Otherwise, I can't do that because I can't lie. So I went to Growy Mill when I was 10 years old. It was a place where they ground up corn to make cornmeal back in the 1860s, 1870s. Something a 10-year-old would really like to see, right? Cool. So I went there, but what I found there was this. Giant foams of soap bubbles as tall as the ceiling were in the river there because they had phosphates in the detergent that would make foam like this. They don't have phosphates anymore, but it woke me up. 3 years later, I made a paper about Lady Bird Johnson's Keep America Beautiful, about litter on our roads. 3 years after that, I was involved in a recycling program in my high school, the first one in the nation. Mr. Ruckelshaus, the first EPA manager, came out to our high school and gave us awards from the White House because we started the first one. 3 years later, I rode my bike every day to junior college. After that, I rode my bike with my kids as much as I could to make a statement about environmental action. In other words, what you can do about it. We went 13,000 miles, didn't use the car for 100 days out of the year for years on end, and we saved 6,000 tons of carbon dioxide from going into the atmosphere, because every mile you drive in a car, it puts 1 pound of CO2 into the air. In other words, instead of graphs and instead of charts about global warming and about weather, what can you do about it? Or what effect can you do? Can you make a statement? Can you stand up here to the political hacks out here in administration and stop the rape going on down south down here of land? What can you do to make things better? This is where I stand on this. And we want to make the earth better. But the earth is in our hands. instead of countless and countless of lectures by well-meaning people about global warming with stats and figures saying how we're not responsible, well, we are. And let's do something about it. Let's make the earth a better place, and thank you very much.